Good evening from the Marine Museum. Thank you everyone so much for joining us this evening and your patience as we tackle this new wave of COVID pandemic. Thank you for joining us over virtual live stream. And 1 second. It's been a few months, so I've forgotten what I need to be doing. And here comes technology at play, so thank you for that. Okay, so again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. First of all, if you'd like to engage with us, feel free to use the YouTube chat function. We'll be operating the Q&A portion of this evening using the YouTube chat. If you're not able to use that function, please by all means send an email to marmus@marmuseum.ca. That's seum.ca, and I'll put that information in the chat as well. I am also very honored to read out our new land and water acknowledgement. The waterways and land located within the Great Lakes catchment area have a long history predating the establishment of European settlements. The waterways in particular are to be acknowledged as the traditional trade routes of Indigenous peoples, together providing a network of trade and travel routes essential to communities since time immemorial. The Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston acknowledges the site it sits on and the water it interacts with to be the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat of the Five Nations Iroquois Confederacy. We thank these nations for their care and stewardship over this land and water, and we are committed to sharing this stewardship moving forward. The Kingston Dry Dock National Historic Site is partly situated on what is traditionally known as Mississauga Point, an early seasonal trade settlement of the Mississauga and Algonquin peoples. Industry and time have since changed the landscape of this geographic landmark. The piers now located at the site are largely landfilled and greatly alter the original waterline. As such, they have become an extension of Mississauga Point. As the only museum in Canada exclusively representing the maritime history of the Great Lakes, we are committed to working with Indigenous peoples to expand our narrative and build lasting relationships that offer opportunities for connecting and engaging with our shared histories. This evening, we're very, very fortunate to have a couple of wonderful speakers who will be talking about first the Algonquin Birch Bark Canoe that was built in Kingston by Chuck Commanda in partnership with the Friends of Inner Harbour and members of Kingston's urban Indigenous community. That's currently on display in the museum for the next few weeks anyways. And we very much welcome anyone to come down and take a look at the canoe itself and admire its beautiful handcrafted design that Chuck Commanda worked on for, I think it was a couple of weeks, but I'll let Mary and Michelle talk specifically about that. And so I would like to introduce Michelle Webb and Mary Farrar, who were the organizers behind the Iroquois Boatyard project build last autumn. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn the screen over to Michelle and Mary. They're with us.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We're totally thrilled to be here at the Marine Museum and to be collaborating to share the incredibly beautiful birch bark canoe that Algonquin master canoe builder Chuck Commanda led. A community build with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and we're really excited about the fact that, you know, Chuck is Algonquin. And oftentimes the Algonquin community gets a bit left out in Kingston because of the predominant Mohawk presence here. So that's totally great. And so maybe we'll start with just how Michelle and I and Chuck got together in the first place, and then we'll go to the parts and how the actual canoe is built, because it's such an amazing design in art and in sustainability. So go for it, Michelle.
Okay. So a few years ago, I specifically ran into Chuck Commanda a few years ago and had a discussion with him about different things. And I knew his grandfather, William Commanda, who was a carrier of 4 wampum belts. And I had a discussion with Chuck about a whole bunch of things, and things got into more spiritual teaching nature, and so I passed him tobacco. And when I passed him tobacco, I got a vision that we were going to be building a canoe, and a canoe was going to be built in Kingston, and there was sort of like this evolving significance that Kingston needed this build, and that Chuck was the one, because I was touching his hand, Chuck was the one that was going to help with this build. And, you know, having had brain injury and stuff, I don't really have a lot of organizing and planning abilities. And, you know, I'm just like one person. And it's like, Chuck, I said, oh, you wouldn't believe what I just saw. And, you know, would you agree to come and do this build if I can get this going somehow? I don't know how it's going to happen. I said, but I'm being told by Spirit it's going to happen. And he said yes. And I said, we need it to happen in town. We need to have accessibility in town for everyone to come. And he said that he'd specifically worked with some Indigenous inmates and did some basket weaving with them, and that he specifically wanted them to be able to come as well because they weren't able to afford to. And I said, yes, it's for everybody. For some reason, it's for everybody. And, you know, for people who don't have the transportation to get outside of the city for where any other locations where they were going to be built. And so I sat on this in my heart and pondered, and then lo and behold.
Well, that was the strange thing, because there was a thing on Facebook saying Birch Bark Canoe build at Murphy's Point Provincial Park. So I thought, well, wow, that sounds interesting. I'll just go up there. And I became completely addicted. I drove up every single day, and I just couldn't believe how incredible it was. I mean, what an amazing art form, and how sustainable, and how, like a canoe like this, 12 feet long, and, you know, it can carry 1,000 pounds, and it weighs 40 pounds, and it lasts 100 years. Completely amazing. So anyway, we'd like to run through a little bit of the materials that are used to make this canoe, and hopefully, if we have a little bit of time, just the depth of personal gratification from coming together in a true spirit of truth and reconciliation that made this happen. So anyway, okay, to start, here is the bark. And the bark is taken from the tree, and the outside of the bark forms the inside of the canoe, and the outside is the outside of the canoe, and it's waterproof. And unlike all of the boats of European origin that we're familiar with, it doesn't start with the frame, it starts with the exterior.
Or other canoes.
It starts with the exterior. So the exterior is sort of piled up, soaked in water, because it gets dried out. So it's soaked in water, and then it is, you know, boards hold it in place. And
you start to form it.
The outside.
And then you start to insert pieces. And the amazing thing about it is that there are no metal nails and there's no glue. And the whole thing is held together with balancing of pressures. Yeah. And the lashing of the cedar root. And so before we started the build, I wanted it to be a complete experience as much as possible, you know, with teachings and that kind of thing, but also sharing with the non-Indigenous the fact that this canoe, the shape of this particular style of canoe, which is called a Wabanaki Chiman, this is a more modern Algonquin canoe. It's not the old traditional Algonquin canoe, but it's in the iconic shape of what we would classify as a modern canoe that people would readily recognize. And so it was an ideal way to have a coming together of people to talk about the canoe as a talking point, to talk about sharing culture, to talk about sharing history, to talk about. And so hopefully the hope was that the Indigenous people for the launch weekend would be able to get together and talk about canoes from all their various nations, because it's not one Indian and one pan-Indianism, there's many nations. We have our own names for these canoes that we build, and they come in different shapes and sizes for the specific waterways that we lived on and the special needs that we had for them. Like if we were carrying things, or we were harvesting rice, or we were, whatever it was we were doing, there were different styles and shapes of canoes. And so it would have been great to have had that opportunity to have those discussions and talk about which one we're going to build next, you know, and that kind of thing. But to have everyone come together and witness the procedure of how this was done. We started at the point where Chuck had harvested the materials already. And so when building a canoe, it's like a ceremony, and you have relationships with the natural world and the materials. And so we started with a ceremony to try to link into the ceremony that Chuck had had when he was harvesting the bark from the tree and harvesting the wood and harvesting the root. And then it flowed from there. With Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working together, some with more skill with tools, or more skill with building, or more skill with both building, and other people with, you know, other skills or other interest, and everybody was trying to help each other. And our role was to facilitate what Kingston needed so that Chuck could do his community build process. So he has a specific community build process where it's built traditionally as community, and he brings the harvested stuff and we do the assembly, and so we build, and then as a community we birth the canoe, and the canoe gets its name. And
okay, so back to the materials. So the bark is the boat itself. And then the ribs here are cedar. The gunnels are cedar. And the thwarts here are ash. And the
ribs. The ribs and
the ribs are cedar.
And the sheathing inside is cedar.
And then there are, the cedar strips inside, completely amazing. Like here is an example, and I mean, to watch Chuck do this, you would be amazed. He takes a cedar tree, takes off the outside, and has a square.
He doesn't necessarily take off the outside.
Well,
but he starts to split it.
In halves, and he just
balancing the pressures to keep it splitting in the middle.
And he will do it again on a smaller the half, and then again on the quarter, and then again, until he ends up with paper thin, done by hand. I mean, just completely amazing. It blew me away every time I saw it. And then
and he did it with the ribs as well.
Yeah, with the ribs too.
But they're thicker.
And here is the spruce root, which is the lashing, and it's collected and boiled and spliced in the same way by hand. So there's a flat side that goes right against the wood, and it wraps around to tie together the bark and the structure. And the nails, this is a nail made out of ironwood. And the only tool that they had in the old days to build the boats with was a beaver tooth. A beaver tooth did everything. And nowadays it's called a crooked knife, and it's made with steel, but it's still the same. All the planing, everything is done with the crooked knife and nothing else.
Yeah.
And so then
you'd use a hammer. You'd have your quote hammer, which would be made of stone. And so you'd have your hammer, and you'd have your crooked knife, or you'd have your beaver tooth, and then you work on doing
the final thing at the end, where you can see here, where sections of bark are sewn together by the spruce root, it would require the spruce gum. And so here is a stick with some spruce gum on it, and the gum would be collected from the trees, boiled down, mixed with lard, put through burlap. I don't know what they used in the old days, but we used burlap to get the impurities out.
They probably would have made some sort of a woven
something
from inner bark, some woven strings.
That's right. And so then that was pasted, and that's something where all the kids could be involved, and the kids loved it. And the secret to applying the spruce gum, who would know? You have to lick your thumb. You have to lick your thumb like that and then put it on, otherwise you burn your thumb. And so everybody learned how to, it's sort of like licking your thumb to put out a candle. So it was an incredible experience. Yeah, it
Yeah.
really was.
And
wasn't it?
there's a lot of skill and technology in making variations on the plan to build the type of and style of canoe.
Well, every rib had to be, you know, a slightly different shape, and to make the canoe into the shape, it was all eyeballed. Like there were no measurements.
And feeling in terms
Yeah.
of the counter pressures. But the other thing was that being a master canoe builder, you would know on the fly if something is going wrong, how to make an adjustment, what it would need, what it would take, what it looks like when it's not happening properly, if the bark needs to be wetter, if the bark needs to dry in the sun a little bit longer. And so it's all a big science. And so I noticed here, we're missing a chunk of gum here.
Yeah, that got scraped off, needs a bit of repair.
Yeah, and so the Algonquin and Abenaki people were the ones that, ultimately produced this particular style of canoe. It's Abenaki influenced, and the Abenaki are part of the Wabanaki Confederacy, so this is called the Wabanaki Chiman, and Chiman is the name for canoe in Algonquin. And so you'll notice the spelling and all that is like in the Algonquin orthography. And so they got together and modified the technology in order to create the fur trade canoes, what they needed for the fur trade. And they built them at Trois-Rivières, and then there's a few other places where they were built. And so the technology, you know, can be modified for need, and not every nation, like each nation could have multiple kinds of canoes. And
yes, so I think we better move on because we want to allow Rick to have a good time.
Oh, yeah.
But I just wanted to say
thank...
before we go about where the canoe is now, because it's so heartwarming. The canoe has been adopted as a fellow classmate in the Bridge program, which is the Limestone Board's alternative program for Indigenous students who don't fit in the regular program. And the name of the canoe at an official ceremony is Ozagian, which means one open to another, which is the way we have felt throughout this build, that the beginning of a relationship and the beginning of truth and reconciliation is one being open to another. And we're so happy to have Rick Revelle join us because he is a wonderful young adult writer. And I mean, it's not just for young adults, believe me, his stories are just super and really fun.
And I've seen some gray-haired ladies asking the library for the 4th edition in the series to be purchased by the library. And so all ages are reading it. And really grateful for Rick to be able to write you know, these books. And so he's speaking from an Algonquin perspective, but he's also done a lot of research. And so he's trying to include a more fuller perspective from the Indigenous. And it's nice to hear, I'm excited to hear what he has to say, but it's awfully nice for the Marine Museum to offer to bring him and allow the Indigenous voice to be heard from an Indigenous perspective.
So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Mary, for the forward, as I've been calling it, and for allowing us to display Ozagian in the museum over the last couple of weeks and over the next few weeks. We are very grateful for that. I would like to introduce our speaker for the evening, Rick Revelle. I've had the opportunity now to speak with Rick a number of times, and I'm very much looking forward to this longer version of the talk that we had the other day with the school groups. For those of you who don't know, Rick is the author of the Algonquin Quest series. The series follows an Algonquin Native family unit as they fight to survive in the harsh climate of warfare, survival from the elements, and constant quest for food during the pre-contact period of the 1320 to 1350s. The series takes place in the St. Lawrence Valley, the Great Lakes, and the Rocky Mountains. Rick introduces readers to the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, Lakota, Mi'kmaq, Mohawk, and Lakota languages as they are used in the vernacular in the 4 novels. The last of the series, Algonquin Legacy, is set to release in 2021. Actually, correction, I now know that it has been released, so I'll let Rick provide information on how that can be accessed. Rick is a member of the Ardoch Algonquin First Nation and is a knowledge keeper with the Limestone District and Algonquin Lakeshore Catholic District School Board. So without further ado, I'd like please join me in virtually welcoming Rick to the screen. Thank you very much, Rick.
Thank you, Miigwech. It's an honor to be here tonight. And I have to give a shout out to Michelle Clairbuck because she's an expert at this Zoom. I did something for the Marine Museum on Tuesday and for the Limestone School Board. And when I got home, I had this email that there was 1,100 students online watching it. And that had to be a record for me for my Zooms this year, that I had 1,100 people attending. So maybe we'll break that tonight. We'll have 1,104. So thanks to Mary and Mrs. Webb for that beautiful explanation of building a Birch Bark Canoe. I have one here, but not quite the size of that. I think this might have been used by Glooskap and his two dogs when they shape-shifted. But it's basically made the same. And somebody did a great job on this, and I picked it up someplace in an auction just so I could take it to schools to show. So like Michelle and Mary were talking about, I've written 4 novels about the 1300s pre-contact. And if you read them all, you've traveled from Newfoundland to southwestern Ontario to the Dakotas to the Rocky Mountains. My books loosely follow the travels of the Anishinaabe from at the request of the 7 prophets as they left the East Coast and went to the Rockies. And I use the native languages in the vernacular, and they're historical fiction, but every place in my books that I mentioned, you can actually travel to. And I use native languages for people's names, or animal names, and place names. And travel. How did they travel? They traveled by canoe. And it's amazing how far that the natives in that era would travel by canoe. Where we would think a lot about getting in a vehicle and driving from Quebec City to Niagara Falls. They would get in a canoe and do that. And think nothing of it. The Haudenosaunee, who were, I always say that were east of the Rocky Mountains, there was three or four really strong nations, and the Haudenosaunee was one of the strong nations. They were, I guess you could call them, they were in expansionist mode, and probably around the 1600s, 1700s, and they would think nothing of it and get into the canoe and travel to Illinois to attack the villages of the Illinois. And at that time, themselves and the Iroquois and the Blackfoot east of the Rocky Mountains were the strong nations, and plus the Anishinaabe, the 3 fires of the Anishinaabe. Now, I did a little bit of research, and I just wanted to read what I came up with, because the woodland natives, they basically had 2 canoes, and we're not talking about the Inuit here in the north. Their canoes and umiaks and kayaks were made out of skin, but the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people, it was birch bark and elm. And the birch bark, as Mary and Ms. Webb explained, enabled the construction of canoes that were lightweight, waterproof, and strong. They did not shrink, so sheets of it could be sewn together. And with proper care, they could last a lifetime, unless you took them down a set of rapids and banged them around, and then you're going to have a lot of repair to do. You're going to have to find some spruce gum and repair. And they were probably if they were going through rapids every day, they were probably going to be having to do repairs each night. They only weighed about 50 pounds, so one person could portage with them. And during this early period, the Iroquois used elm bark canoes. And the elm bark canoe, let's see if I can get this on here. That's an elm bark canoe right there. Okay. And they were easy targets on the water for the swifter and more maneuverable Algonquin Birch Bark Canoes. So elm bark was favored for the Anishinaabe, for the eastern woodland tribes, for constructing both houses and canoes. And the bark could be peeled off in whole sheets, and elm trees were capable of growing to tremendous sizes and manipulated in multiple ways. Elm bark was not very long lasting in rough water though. However, so the Iroquois regarded these canoes as disposable. They were the first disposable materials on Turtle Island, you could say. They used them primarily for situations when a canoe needed to be constructed quickly and the longevity of the vessel was not a concern. An elm bark canoe was advantageous because it could be left at the beginning of a long journey, and if necessary, a new one built when it was needed again. Construction was simple, relatively quick, and one sheet of elm bark was folded to make the bottom and sides of the vessel. And the open ends were sewn together with cedar or tamarack roots and a sealant made out of cedar, pine gum, pitch, or resin applied to make it watertight. And cedar planks would be tied across the middle to keep the sides from collapsing inward. So I don't know how good a picture this is, but let's see. That's the elm bark canoe right there. Lightweight and disposable. Now, if the Iroquois wanted a vessel that would last longer, they used half of a hollow log to make a dugout canoe, or used a much more labor-intensive version made a birch bark canoe. The Iroquois made canoes by chopping down huge trees and then lighting small fires in the logs. And after burning out the middle, they would scoop out the ashes using stone tools. They fashioned huge oars from the limbs of the trees, and a giant canoe for the Haudenosaunee could hold 100 people. So they're dugout canoes. Now this one wouldn't be able to hold 100 people, but that's a dugout canoe that the Haudenosaunee would use. And a little bit, the dugout canoe, for if there was warfare on the water, which could sustain more strikes, arrow strikes, and even bullet strikes. Now, if you go out to the prairies where there was no trees, they used a bull boat, a useful small boat made by American Indians and frontiersmen, made by covering a skeletal wooden frame with a buffalo hide. And this is a bull boat, and that's made out of a buffalo skin. Now, the research that I did, it was mostly the women that would use this, and they would go across the Missouri or the Mississippi, and if they were moving, they would transport things. Now, I think that if you got caught in a set of rapids with these, that they would be like riding the Magic Saucer ride at Walt Disney World, because they would just spin and spin. They were waterproof and probably were arrow-proof. Now, if you were on the water with a birch bark canoe, even though you could really paddle these quick and maneuver them a lot better than the Haudenosaunee can. An arrow, like this is an arrow with an obsidian tip on it. One of these, a well-shot arrow could go right through it, no problem. They shot it right at the water line, they were going to have trouble. There was going to be leaks there. And arrows at that time, you could put an arrow right through a person. They were so strong. So a boat, a birch bark canoe wasn't going to stop it. So that even speed, they relied on speed to get away from their enemies with these birch bark canoes. But if the enemies caught them and started shooting muskets at them after contact or arrows at them, they would run into problems. But and in my research, natives in birch bark canoes could do 55 strokes a minute, and that's pretty fast. I don't know how many kilometers an hour it is. I'm just reading a story about in the 1700s, and that's what they averaged, 55 strokes a minute. That's what the Curie de Bois averaged, and that's what war parties would average, and they would sustain that for the full day. So you can just imagine. I canoed. Now, if anybody ever canoed and think that they could do 55 strokes a minute, which I couldn't do, I'm 6 or 7 strokes a minute, and maybe with my wife in the canoe. So you can just imagine how well shaped these natives were at that time. Now, during that time, I talked to a guy named Mr. Finkelstein, Max Finkelstein, and he was a canoeist that I phoned up to see. I wanted to know what kind of waterway would they bring down in Ontario from the Ottawa River, because that's where the Amawini, the Algonquin people, lived, and if they wanted to come down to Lake Ontario. And he said that they would probably take what's now the Rideau Canal, because that was an old warrior trail, and less chance of getting ambushed, less rough water, because if you took the Ottawa River, there was the length of the Ottawa River from Montreal to Lake Nipissing and going down the French River, there was about 50 portages, and every time you took a portage, there was a chance of you getting ambushed. And that was how warfare took place pre-contact, was from ambush. We could not have, and even after contact, we could not afford to lose warriors. We had no place to go to replace warriors. It was, if you lost a warrior, that was a big loss in your community. Unlike the battles that were in Europe where they meet on an open field and after the next couple of days later, they go to the slums of London or Paris and just haul guys off the street and have them join the army. We didn't have that capability. If we lost a warrior, there was children and a wife involved, and somebody would have to look after them. You do not realize how community oriented the native population was at that time and how family oriented they were. So, and sometimes they would take out for 2 or 3 months to go either on a trading exhibition pre-contact or even to do a morning raid. And a morning raid is a MOURNING, and that would be a raid because somebody else attacked them previously and took their women and children and to help their community grow. So we suffered at that time. There'd be warfare over hunting grounds, but it would be mostly warfare over, trying to capture somebody's women and children. And if that happened, and usually if somebody lost a warrior, they would fashion, and I went to war, and a widow, she would come up to me or somebody, they said, well, I want you to bring back a captive. And they would make a special rope with a noose on it, and if, after contact, there would be beads on it, or before they, porcupine quills and that. And they would expect you to put that around somebody's neck and bring it back to them, so they could adopt them in their tribe and replace somebody that passed away or died through warfare. So captives, that was you were a very big warrior if you brought back a captive. Brought back scalps, that was important too, but if you brought back a captive to replace somebody that died. So the Haudenosaunee, though, what I've read about them, they traveled the Great Lakes just like you get on 401 today. It was amazing that how they would think nothing of going up to Lake Superior and raid the Anishinaabe or raid the Lakota, who were pre-contact. They were woodland natives. They weren't into the prairies yet, because the horse didn't come along to the late 1600s, early 1700s. And in all my books, all the travel takes place on water and on foot, but a lot of canoe travel and a lot of, and they're either going to trade, they're going to hunt, they're going to warfare. And the canoes were so important on these waterways. And you just can imagine living along the Great Lakes. You could go any place by water, any place at all. And you could go You could go down through Lake Ontario, up through the Trent River system, up to Lake Simcoe, and up to Georgian Bay. There'd be portages involved. You could go up the Ottawa River to Lake Nipissing and down the French River into Georgian Bay and up to the north, and then go up into Cree territory. After contact, the Coureur de Bois, they would leave Montreal. They would leave Montreal, have Masse and Lachine, and go all the way up to the Great Lakes systems and go to Athabasca just to take trade goods up. 6 months and portages. And when they portaged the Coureur de Bois, they were responsible for 90-pound packs. And these men were 5'5", 5'6", and you take the canoes and you portage with a 90-pound pack on it, and if you took more than 90 pounds, you got a Spanish silver dollar if you could carry 180 pounds on your back. Peter Newman, one of his books, writing about the Hudson's Bay Company, talked about this Indigenous man that worked with the Coureur de Bois, and he took 40 90-pound packs on a 20-mile portage and never stopped down the rest once just to make 3 silver dollars. So you can figure how strong they were, what kind of shape, even though they weren't very big, 5'5", 5'6", the Coureur de Bois, and they measured the length of a canoe by a pipeful of tobacco. So somebody would ask them, how long is this canoe till we stop again? Oh, 2 pipefuls of tobacco. Now, Native people on a portage, you would most likely come upon a map of birch bark or a piece of bark affixed to a tree, and there would be a picture of a half sun or a quarter sun or a full sun, and that would tell whoever came next how long the portage would be. So if the portage was a full day of unloading and going, they would draw a full sun on that birch bark. So even though we didn't have any written language, they drew maps, and they had and drew designs on them. I want to read you a story about that I wrote in my 3rd book, Algonquin Sunset, and it takes place on a real river that I paddled on. And the Salmon River starts just north of number 7 highway, runs all the way down through a system of lakes, Tamworth and through all those small villages and Roblin, and goes into the Bay of Quinte. And we were canoeing. I was with the Iroquois Canoe Club one time, and we were canoeing, and we're on a section of the Salmon River that I can still remember. We stopped for lunch. We had this big rock face, and it ran all the way from the river all the way to the forest, and that's where we ate. And I don't know if I ever have an opportunity to write about something like this, I got to write about this. And then we came to this spot in the river. There was 2 places where we had to get out of the canoe. One on a big hill, up a hill, and down the other side, and then another side where the water level dropped down enough that we couldn't take the canoes through. There was some rough water and some rock, and we had to get out of the canoes to walk them through. And everybody got out, and some of us were slipping and falling in the water because it was slippery. But the trees just enveloped this area, and it was a hot day in July, and you could hear the birds, and you could hear the bugs, and you could hear the water running. And I thought, oh, this is amazing. I need to put this in a book. And I did. And I wrote I'm just going to read, I got about 2 or 3 pages here I want to read about this, what happened when I put it in the book. Once all the fires were completely put out, dogs and people were quick to step into their respective canoes and continue their journey. The river we were on was a connecting stream to a system of lakes that would take us to our villages another day or 2 away. There would be one small portage on this river, but it was steep going up and then coming down the other side. The river at this time of the Abatani Binogisus, the berry moon in July, was deep enough to paddle in most spots, but there were 2 areas where we'd have to get out, the portage being the second. The first place we'd have to get out was a short stretch of white water that wasn't deep enough to shoot through. We'd have to walk in the water and guard our jimon canoe through the rocks. Paddling under the hot afternoon sun, I faintly heard the sound of water rushing over the rocks, telling us we were close to where we'd have to get into the river and pull the boats. As the other three paddled, I steered the canoe towards the shore, where all of us could easily exit and wade the river past this rocky hindrance. Mishko, my dog, slowly stood on his haunches as we neared the shore, emitting a low, throaty growl and perk in his ears. There was probably some sort of wild animal nearby that he had caught the scent of and was trying to identify. This part of the waterway wound through a thick forest that not even the sun's strong rays could penetrate. The warriors who had left their canoes for the shore to scout ahead and to guard the rest of us from any trouble were soon swallowed up by the darkness as they ventured in. Forgetting the dog's agitation, I stepped in the water to guide the boat through the shallow rapids. The river rocks were slippery, and I watched as a few men lost their footing and fell into the bubbling froth. The two women and the youngest boy stayed in their respective canoes. Most of the dogs leaped into the water to follow their human companions. Mishko stayed in the canoe, still growling. As I skirted the shoreline, the flies left the cover of the woods and feasted on my bare skin. Skittering fish swam between my legs, with the odd one nibbling at my toes. Warriors were strung out along the shores of the river, and they waded to the spot in the stream where the water deepened enough to get back into the canoes. Here they all grouped together and waited for the boats as they came down single file. The forest seemed too quiet to me. All the birds and insects had stopped their racket. Then the shrill scream of a solitary tisting blue jay alerted the forest, setting off the other birds and creating a deafening chorus. One of our warriors, who had been scouting ahead, slid down the embankment into the stream, reddening the water around him and the gathering canoes. At that same moment, as another boat reached a closely knit cluster at the end of the rapids, I took my eye off where I was walking to watch as the body slid into the water among our canoes. In that instant, I slept. Mishko let out a fierce bark, and I fell into the river, grasping the boat and simultaneously hearing what I thought were several sounds. There was an intense burning in the center of my left hand. An arrow had pinned my left hand to the canoe hull. I couldn't feel any pain, but neither could I remove my hand. Mishko was now barking continually because of the screams of the women and the dead and the dying warriors. I gazed up at the opposite bank shore and caught sight of a Nadawasu warrior with two black lines painted across his face and a red streak on his forehead. I knew this man. He was a sworn enemy of the Anishinaabe and as ruthless as they came. Otehihaka Minielk was his Nadawasu name, a warrior who wore many eagle feathers because of the Anishinaabe scalps he had taken. The Nadawasu were wading into the river, swinging their war axes and meeting our warriors who had survived the initial onslaught of arrows in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle. Mishko, stop your noise, I cried. Lay down. The dog, startled by my raised voice, immediately obeyed and lay down the boat with a thump. Turning my eyes to the opposite shore, I spotted where I could get to a landing, remove the arrow, and returning to help to my people. As I approached the shore, a large rabbit was sitting there on his haunches and seemed to wave to me to come to him. I was starting to feel the effect of the arrow now, and I was racked with chills. Blood coursed down the side of the canoe, coloring both it and the water red. When I clambered onto the shore, I looked up in the eyes of a tall warrior. He reached down, he grabbed me, pulling the canoe and myself to shore. Then he broke the arrow, releasing my hand. I gazed up and asked, "Who are you?" "Nano Bujo." Then I blacked out. And that's just how natives got around then. And many times ambushes were set up. They always had to be vigilant, especially when they got out of the canoe and did portages. Like Max Finkelstein told me, the safest way to come down was coming down where the Rideau Canal is, except at that time the old Warrior Trail came out of Gananoque. And when they made Rideau Canal, they didn't want to bring it out of Gananoque. It was too close to the American side of the border, so they brought it out of Kingston. When I wrote that book, the second book, Algonquin Spring, I had to find out if how the Mi'kmaq would have got to Anacostia Island, because they like to go there to hunt bear. And I don't know, a lot of people don't know about Anacostia Island. It sits in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It's 2.5 times the size of Prince Edward Island. It has 21 rivers that drains it, and a waterfall 150 feet higher than Niagara Falls. It doesn't have the same gownage. Dandelions grow 8 feet tall there because of the amount of precipitation they get. About 220 people live there. And until the 1940s, it was owned by a Belgian duke. Before that, it was owned by a lot of French royalty. And Canada found out during the 1940s that the Germans were trying to buy this island from this Belgian duke to put a U-boat base in there. So that quickly changed hands to the Canadian government at that time. It's a unique place. It's the only place west of the Rocky Mountain, east of the Rocky Mountains, that I was never able to visit, because you either got to go there for 7 days and take a ferry from Sept-Îles and drops you off, and 7 days later it picks you up, and or you can fly in from a small place in Gaspé Peninsula. A very interesting place. So I phoned this guy named Todd Labrador, and he lives in New London, Nova Scotia. He's a Mi'kmaq boat builder, a master boat builder. You can follow him on Twitter. And the Mi'kmaq built boats different. They make birch bark, but their boats have a hump in the middle. Because he said when they went to Anacostia Island and the waves got high, it wouldn't tip the boat. It was kind of a bounce. And they made the boat so they can put sails in them, and they make the sails out of fur and that. But I said, these boats, they can do that? He says, I got to tell you a story. He said, my grandfather lived on Cape Breton Island. And he said they used to go moose hunting in Newfoundland, and they go from Cape Breton Island to Newfoundland in these boats. Now, if you ever took the ferry to Newfoundland from Sydney, it's a 12-hour trip. So if you can imagine taking one of these canoes to Newfoundland and killing a moose and then bringing it back, what it was like. And they had this kind of a god that they would pray to, and they would before they went out, they'd go down on the shore. I talk about it in Algonquin Spring, I think, or Sunset, and they go down to the shorelines, and they would give a gift of tobacco, and they'd ask how the weather was going to be, and they would know if they could go out on the ocean. So that it's amazing, and during the 1300s, how these people got around, and how, like, I know I wouldn't get in a canoe in Montreal and one summer and just decide I'm going to take off for 3 or 4 months and go to Lake Superior. And, you have big portage, Lachine, rapids there, and Niagara Falls. I just think it's totally amazing. And I know I only got a couple minutes left because Michelle is going to give me the thumbs up here pretty soon. But I'm reading this book called Hodge's Scout right now. It's a true story about during the French and Indian Wars, about a scout of 40 guys that got wiped out. 18 of them were killed, 5 of them escaped, and 17 were captured. And of these 17 captured, there's a map here. I don't know if you can see it. I'll try to hold it steady. And they were captured in Lake Champlain. And can you see that? Okay. They were captured in Lake Champlain at Crown Point. So if you know where Crown Point is, and it's 800 miles to Lake Nipigon. And they took these captives 800 miles, took them 2 months to get there. And this guy was there for 2 years. I haven't found out how he got back, but he came back with the length of all the way down to the Great Lakes. But it is just amazing how they did this. And it was important to bring these captives back because they had been given nooses by their people, by some women, and said, we want captives to replace people that have died. Just wanted to show you. This would be one of the weapons that they would have used. I was going to bring some props in, but this is a weapon then. And even if the Haudenosaunee came right up beside a birch bark canoe, they could whack a pretty good hole in it with this. And of course, they'd have during contact, they would have the musket, and but they would have these in the canoes, and they would make sure that they kept them dry. So anyway, I think Michelle's given me the what for, and
You're good, Rick. Keep going.
For how long?
You have another 5-10 minutes.
Okay. So it's an interesting. I got to talk about after contact a little bit here about the difference between the Haudenosaunee and why the Huron got wiped out. The Haudenosaunee, the British and the Dutch would trade with the Iroquois, no problem. You give us some furs, we're going to give you a musket, and the powder to go in the horn and balls, and no problem at all, no questions asked. The Huron and the Amawini and the Anishinaabe, they were allies with the French, especially the Hurons. They got them into a lot of trouble. The French, being Catholic, they would give you a gun if you become a Christian, because their thoughts was that a Christian savage wouldn't shoot them. But if they gave a gun to a savage that didn't become a Christian, they would have no thoughts about not shooting them. So their pre-contact, there is about 30,000 Undans, which are the Hurons, and I'm thinking 65 to 75,000 Haudenosaunee, depending on the figures that you see, and about 15,000 Algonquin. So when the Black Robes and the Huron called them crows because they were dressed in black and they were always pecking at them for something, they made sure that the French didn't give the Hurons any guns unless they took mass. And if they took mass, they got a little wooden coin that they could trade for food. So during the late 1600s, of course, the Black Robes brought disease and smallpox, and that was taken away a lot of warriors. The Haudenosaunee went to Lake Nipissing in January, February, with 1,000 warriors and wintered them up there, and probably went up before the water froze. And if you can imagine keeping 1,000 warriors fed through the winter, and then in March they attacked from the north where the Hurons never expected them, and the Hurons were still in their longhouses, and they wiped them out. The Hurons, they had maybe 30 or 40% of them had guns, and the Haudenosaunee, 90% of them had guns. So you can just imagine what it was like. And they went along and they burnt their 3 main villages, and 2,000 of them escaped to Kingston Island, and about 1,400 to 1,800 of them starved, and the rest of them went to Quebec. And there's a Huron reservation north of Quebec City now, and then some other ones split off and went to the States, and they're called the Wyandots. But that was all over religion. The Beaver Wars caused a lot of problems because the Iroquois had trapped out northern New York State. They needed beaver to get guns and iron implements and tomahawks. The Hurons were the middleman between the Cree and Montreal. They figured if they could wipe out the Hurons, that the Cree would trade with them, and they could get their guns through that. And it was what I always say, you know, the little beaver, unbeknownst to him, caused a lot of problems in Turtle Island once the Europeans came. You won't read about that in my book because I talk about all pre-contact, and the battles in the book are mainly over just, you know, hunting grounds and morning raids and just bumping into each other at the wrong time, or, you know, things happening. So yeah, the guns caused a lot of problem. I had an elder tell me one time that four horsemen on the Pokalops for Indigenous people were guns, alcohol, disease, and religion. And he said this stuff wiped us out. So that's just something to think about. That was probably his opinion. But anyway, how we doing? You want me to talk some more? 1 minute? Okay.
I was just, I'm gonna open, 1 second here. We're dealing with a couple computers. So I'm gonna invite anyone listening to submit any questions that they have using the YouTube chat or by email to the email address that I've put into the YouTube chat. And while we're waiting for Rick, if you want to touch upon one more thing.
Yeah, I'll just quickly talk about my books. You can get my books at the Kingston Library, any library in Canada, any bookstore in North America. You can get them online. The first 3 books were published by Dundurn Press, so you can go right to them. The 4th book, the final of that series, is Crossfield Publishing, Algonquin Legacy. The books have a great cover on them. I had nothing to do with the covers, but and if you go to school, most of these books are in the library. That's the first one. That's the second one. This is the third one. An author once told me, he says, if you ever talk at the end, always close the deal. Show them your books. That's the 4th one. So I always remember that. And if you read, one last thing, if you live back at Sharbert Lake, or if you're around Sharbert Lake, the library back there, I donated 150 research books, all nonfiction, historical nonfiction, and it's in the Granite Ridge School Library. And you could probably say, if I sent you, that you could probably borrow it from them, because a few people have, and there's some amazing out of print books back there. I can recommend 2 books for you to read. Thomas Constantine, he wrote The White and the Gold, but when the French first came to Canada, and another guy, Richard Burleth, wrote a book called Bloody Mohawk, but it's not about the Mohawks, it's about the Mohawk River. If you really want to read what was happening at contact, these are great books to read. So I appreciate Michelle organizing this, and I just met her really last week, and she's a great organizer, and the Marine Museum is lucky to have her, because she's pro Marine Museum, that's for sure. And I'm still amazed at what she did on Tuesday, getting that together and working with the school board and bringing all those people in. So Michelle, you're a great credit to the city of Kingston.
Thank you very much, Rick. And thank you so much for your presentation. It was lovely to finally have a speaker talking about Indigenous water travel, because it's one way we've been touching upon lately, but to have someone who's done so much research and who's written so much about that particular period that, as you say, is so rarely written about and spoken about. I'm very grateful for that, and to come together for the display of our birch bark canoe. Yeah, it was for anyone who missed it at the beginning. Rick did a presentation to a local school groups on Tuesday, and read from one of his chapters, and then talked about the research and writing process. And as a researcher myself, I know the amount of reading you have to do alone, and it's certainly writing about fiction. Rick talk a little bit about some of the characters and who they were based on. And I very much enjoyed how it all kind of tied together and how it was drawn from your personal life. And you're talking about the passage that you read stemming from your trip along that particular river and how it flows together. Just a reminder, if anyone is interested in asking Rick any questions, I invite you to submit them over the YouTube chat, or I'm going to check the email again in a minute. And let's see here. I wondered if maybe if you could touch a little bit about, you mentioned the dogs the other day, and that really surprised me about how much the dog was an important part of their way of life, and an important part of the sorry, there go the sound effects again.
I love that.
She's playing those purposely.
It's a great time to do that.
She's been rehearsing.
Yeah.
And just talk a little bit about the dogs and how, the importance to Indigenous peoples at that particular time.
Yeah, the dogs were the only domesticated animal the natives had until the horse came into them. And when the horse came, they didn't know what to call it. They called it the sacred dog. For woodland natives, each family would have 200 or 300 dogs, and on the prairies, they would. Anything that I've read, they'd have 800 or 900 dogs. If you can imagine, pre-horse on the prairies, those huge teepees that they had, which were made of 10 to 12 buffalo skins, and the women could take them down in 10 minutes, and they had to load them on dog travois. So everything inside that tent and out and all the skins and all the lodge poles had to be moved. And plus, if there were small children, they went on the back of these dog travois. And the women would have packs. The men would have to have their hands free to guard against wild animals and to guard against enemies. And the dogs, there would be dogs on the loose, that they would be guarding everything as they traveled to and were sentinels. Dogs were used for beasts of burden, for war, for hunting, and for food. And they were eaten a lot if there was no food. And they were a delicacy at certain times. The Anishinaabe, they would eat a dog before they went to war. It was good luck. So, and a lot of time, I read one story where they were pre-horse, and they were going through the prairie grass would be up to your shoulders, and there was a buffalo stampede. Buffalo came through, and all the dogs took off, and these dogs had kids on the back, and they lost the kids. They couldn't find the children. They said they lost about 8 or 10 kids during the stampede. They couldn't find them. Lost in this grass. The dogs had took off. The kids bounced off. So that these are things that you wouldn't even think that would happen in normal life, and that it happened because they didn't have horses then, and even if they strapped the kid on that travois and the travois broke apart and off the dog, the kid was gone. So for the woodland natives, we didn't have quite as many dogs, but again, it was the same thing: beasts of burden, food, war dogs. An interesting study that I read, I couldn't put it in my books because it was a modern study. I talked about the population of the Haudenosaunee and the Amawini and how the big difference was. And some archaeologists had dug up some graveyards and studied the women in that, the Haudenosaunee and the Hurons and the Amawini, and they realized why there was a population difference, and they tied it into, first of all, food, because the Haudenosaunee and the Huron lived in longhouses. They farmed. They would move every 8 to 10 years after the soil depleted. The Amawini, the Anishinaabe moved with the seasons. Every season they would move. We were hunters and gatherers, 70% meat eaters, whereas the Haudenosaunee and the Hurons were 70% vegetarian. So as a young girl, you're born in a Haudenosaunee or a Huron family, And at 6 years old, when you could carry a pack, you would carry a pack, maybe 15 pounds on your back, and the older you got, the more weight you carry. But you would move once every 10 years. So it was a 6 and 16, twice in 10 years you would move. A 6-year-old girl that was Anishinaabe or on the Winnie, by the time she was 16, she would have moved 40 times. She would have been carrying 40 or 50 pounds on her back. And this archaeologist, they found that these young girls, especially the Anishinaabes, their cervixes had collapsed at that young age of carrying these weight. They had trouble bearing children. 1 or 2 children die at childbirth because their cervixes had collapsed during their growth period, which I found is amazing. And this is how they compared the population difference between these groups of natives, and especially like the Haudenosaunee were a stronger warrior. They're a little bit taller. They didn't burn as many calories as my people did going out hunting all the time. And the West Coast natives barely burned any calories because they had the salmon right at their doorstep. And they hardly ever hunted deer or mountain goat or elk because salmon was right there. So they had built these elaborate cedar houses, elaborate cedar clothing, these big hats, huge war canoes, lots of warfare because they had the extra time. It was like, you get this job nowadays, you got all that extra time, you can do all these renovations on your house. It was like that at that time. And they didn't burn a lot of calories hunting. And if you compare that across, like even in the prairies, a lot of calories burnt just trying to chase a buffalo down. Once you caught the buffalo, there's a lot of calories there. That's why they gorge themselves. And
Thank you.
You're lucky that I can't stand up because I talk a lot better when I walk around.
That's quite all right. Next time. So we had a question come in from Vicky who's asking about the paddles and what they were made of.
Well, most of the paddles will be made of ash. I haven't got paddle, like my paddles that I had for my canoe were made of cherry, but they would make them of ash, something strong. If it was quick, they would just, like I talked about the Haudenosaunee, would make these quick canoes out of just stripping elm down. They would just break branches off and use them. But they would, the Anishinaabe would take some time and they'd get ash tree and they'd whittle it down and or beech or anything like that. Anything that that it was strong enough or it was soft enough also too that they could shake around.
All right. I'm just wait for if there's any other questions, but another one I had was maybe of talking a little bit about, you talked a bit about the canoes and portaging and movement of people and goods. What other uses might have canoes served?
Well, they war and hunting, and that was the main, and trade too. This story that I read where they were attacked on the river, they had just came back from trading with the Cree. They had went up and traded with the Cree. They had a big lacrosse game with them, and they would have traded dogs at that time, and they could have got caribou from the Cree and something that they couldn't have got down here, and different pelts and that. And natives loved to gamble, and they had lots of games that they would gamble on. In my books, I talk about the games that they played, and they would like one was what's under the moccasin, or where's the stone under the moccasin, and they had a circular, it looked like a dream catcher that they would throw in the air and they'd shoot arrows through it or throw a spear through it, and everything was evolved around war. Some of these outside games, especially lacrosse, and that was called the little game of war that the creator gave them to practice war, and it would prep them for war because you're going out and you're running and you're hitting these guys, and they would play. Some of them would play on a mile field, and there'd be 200 or 300 of them out there whacking each other with sticks, and sometimes they would use it to settle just a problem. Just have a game of lacrosse. So that the canoes would, visit maybe not like a Sunday visit, we would get in a car, but you would go and trade and visit in the summertime. And it was essential to have these. That's the only way they were going to get around unless they walked. And this part of Ontario that we live in, there's lots of waterways. And at that time, the only dams that were around were what the beaver made. There was no man-made dams.
Yes, our blessed waterways. Thank goodness for those. There was, I had, one of us in the background here, actually, I think it was Michelle touched upon, reminding me of the use of canoes in terms of fishing or harvesting.
Yeah. Oh, yes. When there's an article in my first book, there's a story about harvesting rice. There's two quick stories. So harvesting rice, there would be somebody paddling, somebody with a big stick, and you would bend it over. You would bend the rice over into the boat and whack it with another stick, and the kernels would flop off. And then you would make sure that there was enough drop back into the lake for the rice to grow again. So then you took it to shore, and the women would take it and put it on a blanket, okay, and dance on it to break the heads away from the chaff. And then they would take the blanket and they would toss the rice up in the air and let the chaff blow away. So there was a process to that. Another use, of course, fishing, but the eel, the American eel, I always have problems pronouncing it. It's French, and my wife is French. She can pronounce it. Chaudière Falls at Ottawa. It's called Kettle Falls. The natives used to call it Kettle Falls because it came down and whirled on this big rock and made a big hole in the rock. But that's where they went and harvested American eels. And they would go down in a canoe. I also got a chapter in my book. I had to phone an American eel specialist that lives in Bancroft and talked to him for an hour about this, and it was amazing. And what he told me about the American eels, and they would spear them and take them in the boat. Somebody had to sit in the boat with two rocks and crush their heads, because if you didn't kill them, by the time you had about 50 or 100 in the boat, they'd be crawling up your legs and they'd be crawling up your body, and they would be all over the boat unless you were hitting them with the rock. And this guy told me that the American eel had the most protein that the natives could eat at that time, more than elk, more than moose, more than deer, more than anything they could catch. The American eel had the most protein that they could find, and they'd skin them and they make clothes out of them because the skin was waterproof. So nothing we ate ever went to waste. Nothing we ate ever went to waste. And if they did not have a canoe, there'd be a lot of stuff. There'd be a lot of starvation, because they needed those canoes to get around, to trade, to fish, to hunt, or you're stuck in one spot. It's just like today, if you didn't have a car or you didn't have a bicycle, you couldn't get any place. So, and like I said before, they take canoes amazing distances to get where they wanted to go. And the Mi'kmaq, they would go in the ocean with them. They wouldn't be afraid. No fear.
Thank you, Rick. I've just checked. I don't see any more questions, but if anyone does have any questions, I'm more than happy to forward them by email to Rick. So please feel free to email the email address that I provided in the chat, marmas@marmuseum.ca. And I'm going back to my screen here, double check. Okay. So Rick, I would just love to say once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was an absolute pleasure to work with you and to schedule all this in. And thank you for everyone for your understanding as we navigate yet another increase in local cases. But we very much hope to be able to welcome you in person at the future event, perhaps next summer out on our pier.
Yeah. We'll take,
So
we'll get married to get somebody, we'll take them out for canoe rides for a nickel a piece.
there we go. We'll get that, or that birch bark canoe out. There we go.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. So again, thank you so much, Rick. And thank you, Michelle and Mary, for joining us this evening to talk about the bill that happened last year in autumn, September 2020, with Chuck Commanda and more dog effects in the background, with Chuck Commanda and the Friends of Inner Harbour and members of the urban Indigenous community in Kingston. Thank you everyone so much. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. If you're interested in joining our upcoming speaker nights, please have a look at our website. The next one's scheduled for next Wednesday, actually, with Chris Chafe. And the subject of the talk is Course Correction, Shaping a Legacy for the Future, where we're talking about Francis McLaughlin's legacy and the brigantine programs that were set up as a result of his sponsorship. Again, thank you everyone for joining. Stay well, stay safe, and have a great evening. Thank you very much.
And just imagine 700 years ago, driving one of those canoes with 2 or 3 guys in them and 3 or 4 dogs and going someplace. So just like a Sunday with a station wagon.
There we go. And now I'm reminded of the vacation movies. Thank you everyone so much. And I've provided the links to books in the chat. Please have a look. And of course, feel free to use Novel Idea, who I know has been able to order those books in the past or has them in stock.
Oscar's been great to me over the years.
There we go.
He's a great
Hear it from the source themselves.
Yeah. Big Witch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.